thank you for being with us. I am always honored that people are willing to come out on a Friday night to talk about a really important and heady subject matter. Today's theme is provocative and timely. It's also long overdue. And so we are going to have a really interesting discussion tonight. So let me introduce our panel. So I'm going to start closest to me and I'm going to work my way back. So Dr. Megan Ming Francis is Visiting Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington. Francis specializes in the study of American politics with broad interests in criminal punishment, Black political activism, philanthropy, and the post-Civil War South. She is the author of the award-winning book Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State, which tells the story about how the early campaign against state-sanctioned racial violence that was taken up by the NAACP shaped the modern civil rights movement. Francis marshals an extensive archival analysis to show that the battle against lynching and mob violence in the first quarter of the 20th century was pivotal to the development of civil rights and the growth of federal court power. She's currently at work on a second book project that examines the role of convict leasing in the rebuilding of Southern political power and modern capitalism after the Civil War. A proud alumna of the Seattle Public Schools, Rice University, she earned her PhD in politics from Princeton University. And next to her is Dr. Nafees Kahn. Nafees Kahn is Assistant Professor of Social Foundations at Clemson University. He earned his PhD here at Emory in Educational Studies and his BA in Sociology with a minor in History from Tufts. His research interests incorporate the legacies of slavery as related to education and the experiences of African diaspora communities. He serves on the Executive Committee for Slave Voyages, the Transatlantic Slave Database, which many people have used to be able to trace their ancestry to the point at which they came over in the Middle Passage. In addition, he is on the Planning and Advisory Committee of the African Diaspora Consortium, where he is one of the developers of the new Advanced Placement Seminar course on the African diaspora with the College Board. Yeah. To his left is Dr. Darrick Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton is Executive Director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. In addition, Dr. Hamilton holds a primary faculty appointment in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs with courtesy appointments in the Departments of Economics and Sociology in the College of Arts and Sciences. Professor Hamilton is a pioneer and internationally recognized scholar in the field of stratification economics, which fuses social science methods to examine the causes, consequences, and remedies of racial, gender, ethnic, tribal, and nativity inequality in education, economic, and health outcomes. This work involves crafting and implementing innovative routes and policies that break down social hierarchy, empower people, and move society towards greater inclusion, equity, and civic participation. Born and raised in the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, he now resides in the short north section of Columbus, Ohio. He received his undergraduate degree from Oberlin College and his PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Next to him is Dr. Melissa Nobles. Dr. Nobles is the Keenan Sahin Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, and a professor of political science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Nobles' research and teaching have focused on the comparative study of racial and ethnic politics and issues of retrospective justice. Her current research centers on constructing a database of racial killings in the American South from 1930 to 1954. She's working closely with a faculty collaborator and advisory board member of the Northeastern Law School Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Law Clinic. She has conducted extensive archival research, unearthed understudied and more often unknown deaths and contributing to legal investigations. She's the author of 2 books, Shades of Citizenship, Race and the Census in Modern Politics, and The Politics of Official Apologies. She's also co-editor.
Don't say all y'all, right?
She's also co-editor with Jun Hyuk Kwak of Inherited Responsibility and Historical Reconciliation in East Asia. Her scholarship has also appeared in the Annual Review of Political Science, Dataless, the American Journal of Public Health, and several edited volumes. She is a graduate of Brown University, where she earned her undergraduate degree.
Okay.
Where she majored in history, and she earned her PhD in political science from Yale. She's had fellowships at Boston University's Institute for Race and Social Division and Harvard's Radcliffe Center for Advanced Study. She's also served on the editorial boards of Polity, the American Political Science Review, and the Perspectives on Politics. She's also been involved in faculty governance at MIT, obviously, but before she was dean, she served as associate chair of the MIT faculty and vice president of the American Political Science Association, in addition to having been chair of the political science department. And last but not least is Emory's own Dr. Alyasah Ali Sewell. They are Associate Professor of Sociology at Emory University and founding director of the Race and Policing Project. Specializing in advancing quantitative approaches to racism studies, they have identified the empirical links between the political economy of race and racial health and healthcare disparities using policing and housing policy data. Published in a wide array of sociological and interdisciplinary outlets, their research has garnered support and recognition from the National Institutes of Health, the Ford Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Society for the Study of Social Problems, and the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. In addition, the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. They received their undergraduate degree in sociology, summa cum laude from the University of Florida, and their PhD in sociology from Indiana University. All right, so let's start with our discussion. So I want to start with some definitions. What exactly do we mean when we say reparations? Are we talking about 40 acres and a mule? Does it mean cash compensation? So how much? Does it mean affirmative action? So I'm opening this up to everybody, but I'd like to start with Melissa.
Sure. Thanks, Audra. Well, generally, when we think about reparations, it typically means material compensation, monies of some sorts, usually money. Initially, when reparations were discussed, it was in relationship to war, reparations after wars, most famously, obviously, after World War II, but increasingly, arguably too, with World War I, which helped cause World War II. But over the course of the 20th century, it expanded to include governments as well as corporate compensation. So it's while we may think of other things like apologies, which may in some ways be compensatory, those are largely symbolic in certain ways, which may work in tandem with material compensation, but reparations generally means material, something material.
Others.
So of the things you cited, it would be all of it except for affirmative action.
Right.
Right. I would say all of it plus some. The things.
Yeah.
Right. So affirmative action to me is anti-discriminatory policy, aimed at desegregating elites, allowing access to elite stratas for which others might not have had access to. In terms of reparations, I'm just echoing, if I would think of it in three components. It would be acknowledgement, it would be redress, and then potentially closure. And that doesn't mean that if discrimination persists that there are no more claims, but if it's done right, it would mean closure for the atrocities that were committed that it's aimed at addressing.
So we can imagine lots of reasons why African Americans would be entitled to reparations. But what for you is the reason for reparations? I'll start with Nafees.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think part of the reason for it is the legacy of enslavement, captivity, oppression, and repression, right? And it didn't just start one day and then end, and then all things were washed our hands of it. It continued on in differing forms, and so the conversation also has needed to evolve, because as was mentioned before, reparations oftentimes was in a direct repayment to the person or the individual or the company or the country that was harmed in some way or that was denigrated in some way, and they needed that regression. But to think about reparations in the context of the legacies of slavery, we have to broaden what that means, and in part because slavery just, in the U.S. context, it took a war to end slavery. The other American countries, in the Americas, I should say, with the exception of Haiti, they ended slavery through legislation for the most part. The U.S. and Haiti were the only two that went to war over slavery, which gives a different signal that it wasn't going away, right? And so I think there's something around, it didn't just stop, right, definitely when the Emancipation Proclamation, but it continues on in different forms. So we have to think about it in a broader way because it isn't a finite moment or a finite kind of experience, because the effect of it is across generations. It's beyond any one person's lived life as well as their ancestors' life as well.
I just want to add to that, while it's certainly true that in the Americas, with the exception of Haiti and in the U.S., where the war ended slavery, in none of those countries, whether it ended by war or not, was there any kind of compensation for slaves, right? In fact, after the Haitian Revolution, the expectation was that Haiti would pay the French back.
Right, right.
And in fact, part of the claims today of Haiti towards France is to say, give us the money back that we paid you for most of the 19th century for our successful revolution. And arguably, the Haitian Revolution, or all that it could have produced, was thwarted at precisely the time that it could have prospered because they were forced to pay back France for the loss of property. I mean, Haiti was the most profitable of the Caribbean islands, but that's all to say that there's always resistance when it comes to paying back victims.
And oppression doesn't stop at the end of slavery, either in the U.S. context or the Americas context. Indeed, there is scholarship that suggests that slavery ended in various places because it became less profitable, that there were other economic systems that were more profitable and just as exploitive and extractive. So, I think slavery would be one act of egregiousness, but it continues, and we can cite many others throughout American history.
So let's talk about the transatlantic slave trade. So this may seem like stating the obvious, but what did Black people lose as a result of slavery?
Well, to start with what was lost, I guess, separation of families and separation from communities is one of the multitude of losses, to frame it in that way. And it stretched beyond just one nation to another nation. It was a global enterprise that lasted hundreds of years, that involved millions and millions. The estimates range, of around 12 and a half who were put on boats, over 10 million who survived the voyage, but those are estimates, right? And that doesn't count the families that were, separated from, that stayed on, or those who didn't survive the first leg of the journey, right, before the middle passage, if you will, the captivity of it, right? So there's the expanse of people and lives that were lost, and the connections between communities, languages, cultures, traditions was tremendous, right? And so I think just thinking about familial connections, I think, is one starting place. In addition, one framing, and I guess an economics framing, is the loss of potential labor, your own labor. As an individual, you have a potential to, earn your future living, right? And that's stolen by being forced to work for somebody else's benefit. So I think your future is stolen, not just your past and your connection to your family and your community, but also the future, right? And that goes without saying that the present is stolen because your physical body is being put to work and put to someone else's benefit without your say in that. So I think there are a lot of different ways to think about losses, but I think the connections that were intentionally severed. While the remarkable element is the perseverance through that is something that we also have to kind of hold on to, right? That not despite, but almost in direct contrast and resistance to the formations of new bonds, of differing bonds, right? Across, very diverse peoples, right? Who found themselves in captivity, is very much part of that story too. So there's a loss, and I'm not trying to say there's a gain, but there's a survival element to it in this context.
Darrick, can we quantify the unpaid economic contributions of slave labor to the U.S. economy? And if so, how do we do that?
The short answer is yes. The courts every day make economic compensation, both narratives and explicit, based on harms that have been done to people, whether it is specific harm in terms of not being able to work and recoup one's returns for one's labor or returns on one's asset, but also we compensate for bodily harm. So the answer of can we? Of course we can. Will it completely restore some of the dignity that's lost in a population? The answer is probably no. We can't put a financial cost on it, but we certainly can engage in the calculus of describing the lost revenue, the lost potential revenue, as well as the compensatory redress for bodily harm as well as other types of harms.
And are there some sort of well-known brands or institutions where we can directly correlate their success even today to their participation in the institution of slavery? Megan?
So much I agree with in terms of what my fellow panelists have said. One of the things that you just mentioned in your remarks that kind of struck a chord with me was this idea in terms of loss of labor, right? And then just for me thinking, especially as somebody who works basically 1865 to about 1925, that's kind of the historical period, that's my groove. It's also a terrible period, right, in the South. But there's so much kind of this loss of labor that happens during enslavement continues right afterwards. And I think part of the reason that it's so important to have this larger discussion about reparations is to continue to think about kind of the way that damages have compounded over time. That when enslavement ended, it didn't just end, and it wasn't that black people were free, right? But that like their labor was continued taken from them by private individuals, by state governments, by the federal government, and that still happens today. So in the period that just as one example out of many, I focused specifically on Alabama, Texas, and Tennessee, and the ways in which the different state governments in the period after enslavement, while the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were being passed, were at the time trying to figure out ways that they can continue to take black labor, right, for free, basically. And their way, and this is, I think, familiar to many people now, is through a system of convict leasing, right? And so many governments, state governments all across the South, engaged in what we know as black codes, passed new laws, and practiced a racialized type of policing. And you saw so many of these prison populations in state governments, states in the southern states expand. I mean, it wasn't an equal type of kind of in terms of population expansion, but it was, for example, Mississippi, Alabama, over 90% of the prison population in the post-emancipation era was now black, right? For the most part, outside of Texas, there were no penitentiaries in the South. They had been demolished by Union troops. And so what happened is that the state also did not have enough money to feed and clothe these individuals. And so it was the fact that corporations and former plantation owners then approached the state and created a bargain, right, which was that we will house and clothe these individuals, and we will pay you for their labor, and these people will labor for us. And so this was kind of provided a stopgap for many corporations, for many plantations in the South, but it wasn't. I think this is also really important to say that this is not just a story about the South, right? That it wasn't just the South, it was also northern corporations and speculators who were like, what is going on in the South? It's like the wild, wild west. Let's throw some money, let's invest. And this is where you see in terms of a lot of northern companies and Wall Street businessmen investing in railroads across the South that are going to be a lot of the labor being black laborers who are formerly enslaved people. It's also important in my friends in economics have really pushed on this, that it's not just, we only get a kind of part of the picture by focusing on the system of convict leasing, but you have to also examine the ways that a system of convict leasing and new laws also had a different impact on the kind of free wage black labor as well. And so, of course, in terms of the terrible labor contracts for black sharecroppers at the time, people who were not engaged or not caught in the criminal punishment system, but yet still had the impact of what was going on. In terms of, specifically though, to your question, companies that I focus on, and because I'm part of my interest here is in trying to trace, right, in terms of companies that we have that are still around today. Imperial Sugar Company, it's in a number of grocery stores still to this day, is a company that got its start and in terms of its height off of black laborers in Texas, convict laborers. There is also other companies in terms of Alabama and Texas. So for example, JP Morgan's, one of the subsidiaries was Tennessee Coal Iron and Railroad Company, and he really was all about wanting to be one of the biggest kind of coal giants in the country. And so obviously JP Morgan Chase is still very much around today, right? So there's like, when people are like, oh, we don't know who did it. Yes, you do know. Right, yeah, you do. You just don't want to know.
So I'm going to start this question with Ali. So I know many people may be familiar with Ta-Nehisi Coates' 2014 Atlantic article arguing for reparations. So interestingly, he doesn't start with 1619. He starts with a black man born in Mississippi in 1923 who experienced economic exploitation as a boy and as an adult in Chicago. So my question for Ali and then for everyone else is, can you describe the modern day types of discrimination, both de jure and de facto, which could be eligible for reparations?
So I think there are three that I study in my own work. The first one is, and I think we've been talking about it, is asset extraction. It's not just that there is a deprivation of income, but also that we have a deprivation of how we make money or build capital based on that income. So if someone goes to school or someone has a good occupation or someone buys a home in a nice neighborhood, we're not able to capitalize on that. And that is something that still goes on today. It's something that is more marked in black neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods. The second one I'm thinking about is redlining itself. There is actually an issue of redlining in the past. We call it traditional forms of redlining, but also redlining right now, contemporary forms of redlining. And redlining in the past, it was that we were locked out of the mortgage institutions. We could not get assets at all, so we had to use our own quote-unquote capital to raise that aspect to home ownership, which is another form of asset accumulation. And then now we actually have a situation where we're more likely to be in the mortgage market, but we get unsustainable loans. We call them subprime predatory loans. And these loans both reduce our ability to get asset off of those loans, but also increases the likelihood of default, of foreclosure, and so on and so forth. And it also just costs more. It just costs more. The last one I'm thinking about is something we actually really have been talking around, but I think we need to talk about it, is mass incarceration. Not only is there penal labor, where people are getting essentially underpaid for their work, there's also the spillover effects of being formally incarcerated. People are less likely to get jobs, get good jobs, be able to get good homes in good neighborhoods, and so on and so forth. We also have what I study, the illness spillovers of policing or police surveillance, where people as small as living in a neighborhood where there's a pat down, you have an increased risk of morbidity in the forms of diabetes, asthma episodes, high blood pressure, obesity, and believing that your health is poor or fair. That might not seem something that is very important, but we know from research that in fact, believing that your health is poor or fair is one of the greatest indicators of mortality. So it's not just that policing makes you sick, both through direct contact and living in neighborhoods where policing is high, but also that it increases your risk of mortality.
Thank you for that response, Ali, in part because it leads into my next question, which I'm going to direct towards Darrick. We've kind of talked about the wealth gap without directly addressing it. So can you please describe the wealth gap and its connections to the conversation that we've been having so far?
So the wealth gap is dramatic. The typical black household has about 10 cents on the dollar as the typical white household. And that's in the context of medians. If we were to look at mean differences, the differences would be even more dramatic. Black people make up about 12% of the population and have about 3% of the nation's wealth. I'd say that wealth is probably an index, a cumulative index of all the racial, actually it would be probably the best economic indicator of all the cumulative effects of racism and deprivation in economic terms, and I had to qualify that because we have health disparities as well that are dramatic. And what's useful about thinking about wealth in the context of the American meritocracy, I can give you a statistic where I tell you that the typical black family where the head graduated from college has less wealth than the typical white family who dropped out of high school. So clearly, it is not someone's studying hard and working hard as the mechanism to accumulate wealth. The way in which we accumulate wealth is it is wealth that begets more wealth. That without capital, you basically lock in inequality.
Yeah.
And it is getting wealth at a key point when you're a young adult that allows you to get into an asset that's going to passively accrue over your life. That's how wealth is generated. And blacks, you might argue that there have been gains with regards to a black middle class in education, in income, and occupation, but there has never been an American middle class if it's defined in terms of wealth. And that probably becomes the biggest justification, one of the biggest justifications for a reparations argument to, in a retrospective manner, apply justice so that we can account for all the egregiousness that has taken place. One other key thing I'll make to the point is that a lot of that egregious stuff that took place in our history was state complicit. So Megan gave the story of pointing to J.P. Morgan as an example, and they benefited, but the reality is that, and people make the argument, well, I didn't do it, I wasn't racist, but your state did. Your state is responsible for all this egregiousness that took place and injustice, not just in slavery, but in the design of policy. By design, blacks have often been excluded from the benefits of asset-generating policies. It's both by design and implementation. And I know I'm rambling on. I'll give two quick examples and I'll stop. Take the GI Bill. The GI Bill is probably the source of an American middle class, white asset-based middle class. It wasn't like a white asset-based middle class simply emerged. It was literally government giveaways that led to people having access to a down payment or a home, a debt-free college education, or some seed capital to start a business. Now, that's not a bad thing. The government should be actively engaged in providing assets for its people so that they can have economic security of wealth. What's problematic is that the Faustian bargain, in large part to get Southern legislators to go along with a Jim Crow South, excluded blacks. That was the tacit political agreement, both by design and implementation. So, what am I talking about? Social Security excluded domestic and agricultural workers who at the time, 90% of black women were in one of those fields and over half of black men. Or you could take the GI Bill, which was administered in a local Jim Crow context, so you can imagine it was racially disparate. It was administered also in a context where there was not housing expansion because of discrimination, so HBCUs as an institution were not able to grow in the same way that a place like the University of Michigan was because of local housing discrimination. So it is economically just if we're ever going to get over our racial barriers to redress this, and that is why reparations is so critical, particularly in the domain of wealth.
Ali, could you follow up on that and talk about the connections between wealth and health? And you kind of addressed some of that already, but if you could elaborate on that a little bit further.
Right. So there is what we call a direct positive correlation, meaning there's a one-to-one correlation or one-to-one relationship between wealth and health. When black people lose wealth, they lose health. It is not just that they get sick, they also don't have the ability to respond to illness in the healthcare system. One of the main forms of bankruptcy is healthcare bills. Okay? So we start there, and we can also talk about something that I study, that children who grow up in neighborhoods where minorities are more likely to get access to unsustainable loans. This is the contemporary forms of redlining. They're less likely to be able to breathe. Asthma. They're more likely to not only have asthma, but they're more likely to grow into asthma. This is between the ages of 0 and 18. So very young children are more likely to have asthma, more likely to have acute physical symptoms like stomach aches, migraines, and so on and so forth, colds and flus, which are, in fact, they're common childhood problems, but you're more likely to have those problems at a young age when your brain needs the most fuel to develop. The last thing I would say is that we need to think about the Great Recession. The Great Recession had a very strong impact, not just on black people's wealth, but on the wealth of black communities. We're talking about the neighborhoods here. There is a relationship between subprime mortgages and foreclosures. foreclosures and wealth and health, okay? So we know that in neighborhoods where there were more foreclosures, there are also more health problems. Those foreclosures are linked to subprime loans. Those subprime loans are linked to, in earlier decades, the lack of access to mortgages, and all of that is linked to the broader issues of wealth.
So related to this discussion is who is eligible for reparations. So a slavery-centered reparations argument suggests that the descendants of American slaves should be the beneficiaries of reparations in this country. However, nearly 10% of blacks in this country are immigrants. Should they be eligible for reparations? Especially if we think about reparations as restoration for accumulated discrimination or disadvantage. So I might surprise the panel a little bit. I'm going to start with Darrick on this one.
She's trying to put me on the spot and get me in trouble. I see people filming out there. She's trying to set me up. So obviously, this is not necessarily an easy question. In a technical sense, if you're designing good public policy, you find the intended recipients, and if we're framing it in an injustice frame, we identify the injustice and identify, well, who went through the injustice and how do we redress that? Now, one other point is that reparations is not just for slavery.
Yes.
Reparations would go, frankly, one could make an argument about reparations for mass incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
I separate that from a reparations argument because I don't want to dilute reparations. But I certainly would argue that reparations did not end with slavery. It would include the New Deal as an example of things that need to be redressed. So it wouldn't simply be recipients of African slavery in that frame. And then let me also go back to the argument I'm making about designing policy. So when designing policy, those that suffered the egregiousness would be redressed. But also in policy, you end up in scenarios where in application, everyone who's designed to receive the benefits don't always receive the benefits. And likewise, everyone who's not designed to receive the benefits do receive benefits. And sometimes we call that a moral hazard. So there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off in, if we had some criteria, we are very good at keeping data, so it is likely that we can come up with scenarios in which most people that would qualify as having ancestry through slavery we could identify and redress. But in reality, I bet there will be some that we don't. However, there is the risk that you reward people who otherwise might not have been intended to. So I guess I'm giving a long-winded, nuanced answer to say that there would be some consideration about whether you want to not include some people that shouldn't be included by a technical definition, not the argument about people that immigrate to the U.S. and whether they should receive reparations is some people argue they self-selected into a racially discriminatory environment. But let's really dissect that word self-selected. If you're fleeing oppression, I'm not so sure it's self-selection. But nonetheless, it is nuanced and complicated. And then there was one other point I wanted to end on, and I'm forgetting it. That means I'm rambling on. Maybe it'll come back.
Sure.
Okay.
So, I think there are a couple of questions that get raised from this. The contemporary sort of framing of discrimination would also implicate people who are newly arrived in this country, right? Right. So it's not that your being an immigrant is going to shield you from redlining. It's not going to shield you from surveillance. It's not going to shield you from violence. And so, yeah, maybe some people didn't partake in American slavery, but they certainly partake in modern day American discrimination.
And the argument to refute that from the people that advocate that they shouldn't receive reparations is that, again, the argument of self-selection, that they self-selected. But again, the notion of self-selection could be further interrogated. Another point is that we're talking about 10% of the black population. So I think some of the estimates is that about 90% of the black population, people that identify as racially black or would have some ancestry back to slavery. Again, I used to be of the frame that it would only be those that went through slavery, but I'm questioning that, and I'm questioning that from I really don't know the answer. I think a lot of these questions we raise ultimately are going to require a full-throated commission to actually redress these, because it's not a simple answer. It's not a simple answer for many of the reasons I mentioned. And like I said, if indeed some people benefit that otherwise shouldn't have benefited. Now, here's who I don't want to benefit. We know that we've had black people that have literally passed as white and lived life as white Americans. So for me, those individuals shouldn't be able to, or their ancestors don't get to self-select and be black after they've benefited from white privilege throughout their life. So to me, that one's the easy answer. But the question of immigration, I think, is not so straightforward and requires some further thought.
So Nafees, so let's complicate this a little bit further. There are some black people who can trace their ancestry to free people of color. Should they be eligible for reparations?
Well, I would say, families get larger as you go up that tree. And so at what point are you saying they were free, right? And so the experiences, as we've been talking, is so much broader. Now, the complicated story, were they slaveholders themselves? Because there were a few in the U.S. and in other countries, in Brazil, for example, there were quite a few former slaves who ended up becoming slaveholders themselves, which complicates it, right? I think the way I approach that idea of eligibility is, if the intention of the question is to exclude, it creates a bigger, more problematic setup, right? If we're looking to ultimately get to a point where you're proving through papers, which if you were following in the UK with the Windrush generation, right? People who, from the Caribbean who've been living as British subjects for decades, and then all of a sudden they were asked to prove that they were part of this generation through documentation, and they were maybe in their 70s, 80s, 90s. Do they have a lighting bill, a heating bill from when they arrived? No, they don't, but you're asking them to prove it. It starts to get at, mar the moral intention of these types of laws. So I think if the intention is to exclude, that's the wrong premise. However, the idea of being able to trace back to someone who's experienced slavery or have you, that even though as much as genealogy, especially in not just African American, but African, say the diaspora has grown in recent years, there's still that blockage, right? And it was not an accident. It's intentional. When you look at the documentation of the slave trade, you in some cases have individuals, right? There are examples, but not the majority. The majority are numbers, their ages, their heights, their weights, their scars in their descriptions. They're not individuals. So you end up going into an assumption. And so I think, and that's intended, right? Because they weren't treated as human. And so I think if we're trying to figure out, and I agree with the policy in terms of how do we approach policy, but if I would ask the person asking that question, right? Like, what do you mean by, eligibility? What is your goal with that? Are you looking to compartmentalize and put you over here, and then you have to prove yourself? Because we did that before. We did that during slavery. You have to prove you're free. How do you prove you're free, right? And there's, nothing to stop someone from saying, I don't believe that piece of paper in your hand. So I in that context, I would say, let's craft our intentions around reparations. How broad are we talking about? Are we talking about wealth? Are we talking about mass incarceration? Are we talking about looking at the particular private industries who have benefited from it? Are we looking at state governments, national governments? Are we looking internationally? Because slave traders in the U.S. didn't stop on our borders. The connection between Charleston and Barbados was tremendous. The connection between Jamaica and New Orleans was significant in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, or the inter-American slave trade, I should say. And American traders were actively trading in Cuba and Brazil after we abolished slavery, and after we abolished the slave trade, and after we abolished slavery itself. So the idea that it stops at our borders is something that needs to be troubled too. So I think the eligibility question becomes broader, right? A lot more broader and complicated.
I just want to just underscore that if we're going to take the African diaspora seriously and slavery in the hemisphere, then it seems to me that there were many of our people who were slaves in other parts of the hemisphere. I mean, Brazilian slavery didn't end until 1888. The last in the hemisphere to do so. So it seems to me that I very much appreciate the notion of having some moral clarity, at least, and thinking a bit about being inclusive if we're talking about descendants of slaves, since much of the hemisphere slavery was a big part of the economies for many of the most important countries.
Well, Melissa, this next question is first directed towards you. So what kind of form should reparations take? And if we have examples of reparations in the U.S., if we consider the payments that were given to Japanese Americans, for instance, for internment during World War II, and there are also international examples. So are there templates that we can use as an example for how America could perhaps create its own reparations program?
Right. Well, yes and no. I mean, I've studied quite a bit in looking at the experience of indigenous peoples in Australia and New Zealand and Canada. Their claims were a bit different in a way because they were talking about self-governance, and so reparations in a certain way doesn't seem to fully capture all that's desired. But it does relate in as far as there is an expectation that to be a recognition of harm, which is what we're discussing. Nearly all of it requires that there be some deep recitation and reevaluation of national histories. Right? Nearly all of the commissions in which apologies were eventually given and some form of material compensation began with the commission impaneled by the national legislature, typically by governments to the left, that there be a national discussion of history. So, in other words, a re-education. To change the framework such that no Canadian or New Zealand or Australian could say, I didn't know. Which is oftentimes what we hear from white, we didn't know. So the point of having these commissions, which is what made the 1619 Project so important, is to start the story over. You claim that you don't know. Start reading. So we can have a kind of a similar set of facts. They might not all be the same, not at all suggesting there's always going to be agreement. But it can't possibly be that you have citizens who say in 2020 they don't know the extent of slavery and Jim Crow, right? So first that, acknowledgement, which presumably then, if you acknowledge, it then raises the question, then what are you going to do about it? And it sets the stage then for discussion about some kind of compensation or apology, which is what we're describing. And then finally, the actual resolution. And some people would want reparations in part because it's settlement. It seems to cancel the debt, and that's always a concern. Well, if you say you get reparations, does that mean that you're closing the books? Perhaps. But reparations debates rarely close the books. Even in the case of kind of indisputable, which is after the Holocaust, there are continuing debates with Germany regarding paying surviving Jews and their families. And that is dwindling, of course, as people died. But that was deeply contentious about whether the early state of Israel would ask and accept reparations from Germany. Some thought that's blood money. Others thought, don't let the killers, as Ben Gurion said to the Israeli Knesset, let not the killers of our people be their heirs. So these are very complicated questions, but those, I think, provide useful ways of thinking about what we're discussing here.
So from a policy perspective, Darrick, since you work in that space, you've gotten a lot of attention for your baby bond proposal, which is a wealth redistribution plan that has reparative elements. So could you please describe it for those who might not be familiar with it?
And I want to say a little bit more about the last question also.
Sure.
I think another good thing to add on to what Melissa was describing is the acknowledgement allows us to change narratives in the way we describe poverty more broadly. We use anti-black terms when we describe poor people as undeserving. We caricaturize them as welfare queens, deadbeat dads, and predators. If we have this honest, sobering conversation about the ways in which inequality is authentically generated through resource and personhood deprivation, it allows us to get rid of those neoliberal narratives and forge better policies more general, like baby bonds. I'd also want to point out that going back to the controversy of should reparations be a check, right? Should black people literally get an individual check for reparations? And then usually you hear the pejorative terms of they'll turn around and go buy Cadillacs. Well, I like to point out the problem isn't that they'll buy Cadillacs, is that they don't own stock in Cadillac. And they don't own stock in Cadillac because they've been resource deprived through throughout history, and when we were able to accumulate resources, it was never politically secure from seizure. So that's the problem. So, from north-south trade models in economics, some people call it immiserating growth, you end up with a scenario where if you don't own the means of production or capital, and you give a stimulus to a population, you could unintendedly lead to greater inequality. So there is something symbolic about getting a check where there's no conditions, we did this to you, here's a check, buy a damn Cadillac if you want. But reparations should also include some form of capital or asset transfer so that we won't get that north-south discrepancy where you could end up with more inequality than you intended. Now, the baby bonds question, reparations is a retrospective racial and economic justice policy. It retrospectively addresses the accounts, and the goal should be to address it, even if we don't ultimately get there, that should be the goal. Baby bonds is not reparations. Let me say that loud and clear. It is not reparations. Baby bonds is an economically just policy that's also anti-racist, and it's anti-racist because the criteria for inclusion and the outcome of intention are related to dimensions of inequality that are very racialized, and that is wealth. So what baby bonds is a birthright to capital. As we started off the conversation, wealth is resulting because some individuals have access to some capital at a key point in their life that puts them in an asset that will passively appreciate over their life, not actively, passively, like owning a home versus paying rent. The asset appreciation is a passive wealth generating mechanism. So baby bonds gives every American, regardless of gender, regardless of race, a birthright to capital for which they can use when they become a young adult to either secure debt-free education, a home, or some seed capital to start a business. So I see it as a prospective policy that's not a one-time redress, but that would in perpetuity trend America towards a more egalitarian distribution of both capital and access to economic security and wealth.
So this question is for anybody. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Just real quick on this, I mean, one of the things that you raise here that because I have an audience here right now, when people say this, right, in terms of like, what are black people gonna do with this money if they get some reparations, right? The idea, it to me so many times underscores this idea that black people cannot be responsible decision makers about their money, right? And that what that does, right, is it then just kind of like bold faces a very racist narrative that we have, right? So like, if you hear people like go down that road, please stop them. The last thing that I'll say before we get to, I think, probably one of her last questions here, is it strikes me also, the other thing about that question is the lack of imagination that we have about the possibilities of repair in this country, right? And so one of the things, it's like, the idea that could also, in terms of like a check for every black person, could be the only way that we can imagine like a type of repair, right? And one of the other things that we've seen in terms of when we talk to black people about what repair might look like for them, there's a range of different choices. Sometimes it could be a check, sometimes it could be scholarship funds, sometimes it could be land transfer, but there's a whole host of different things that we get when we actually talk to black people about what they might think about in terms of what accountability actually means to them. But the problem is that we don't talk to black people, right? And we don't really ask them about what they need.
So this actually ties into the question. So is reparations a one-shot deal? Can it be paid in installments? Can it be paid forward in subsequent generations? So if we give reparations now in 2020, can our children be eligible for that in 2050 or in 2070? Like what? Yeah, how would this look?
I'm gonna say something.
Yeah.
I wrote down some stuff, and I'm just gonna say it now.
Okay.
If we think about reparations as a discrete form of asset exchange, we got it wrong. Ultimately, we do not understand the ways in which the U.S., Britain, and a number of places within Americas reduced and took away the humanity of black people. We don't understand the ways in which slavery has been splintered into many different institutional forms that include all the things I mentioned and more, okay? So one of the things about the problems with discrete forms of asset exchange is that the impact of slavery is multi-generational and it's dynamic. It continues. If you stopped it right now, it would continue to create problems. Okay, so we call that, in some sense, the ways in which you hit something one time and then it keeps reverberating on and on and on, regardless if you hit it another time. That original energy transfer continues, and that's the way that we live right now. That's why we have multiple institutional forms, including mass incarceration, which is a derivative of convict leasing, which is a derivative of slavery. Right? So we cannot talk about slavery alone. We have to talk about many ways, including residential segregation, including Jim Crow, the ways in which all of these things have reduced humanity, including the ways in which we consider the cultural forms of blackness and the way it shows up.
Although that, in part, is the difference between income and assets. Assets, almost by definition, is intended to be more perpetuity, whereas income is a one-shot deal.
So I'm going to direct this next question towards the political scientists on the panel. So Megan and Melissa, you've studied the politics of reparations. So there's currently a proposal, initially proposed by the late Congressman John Conyers, to create a commission for the study of reparations. What are the chances of this commission being approved by Congress anytime soon?
There's your answer. So,
You go first.
I'll start first.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the other countries that I named. So in nearly all the countries, when they've had those commissions, it's been because there's been support in the legislatures, right? And sometimes by the executive, but certainly in the legislatures. And there's usually been parties which would map onto the Democratic Party here in the U.S., which is why Conyers and such. But at the end, it does have to be socialized and make it through, as all others legislation makes its way through the House. So I'm not at all hopeful of it. At least at the federal level, I think there's much more likelihood of success at perhaps state levels and local levels on different kinds of discrete harms. I'm much more hopeful about that than about the Conyers bill. I mean, but one thing that may be useful about Conyers, in fact, I guess the 1619 project is an example of circumventing the legislatures. I mean, the Congress has proved itself on so many issues to be ineffective, at least in regards to what we need, that there is a kind of experimentation happening in other institutions, from journalists to higher education to community groups. So people are taking their, our futures in our own hands in that regard. So I guess I don't have as much hope for that. Although, with that said, it would be enormously important for the national legislature to not offload its responsibility, since, as was earlier stated, it started with the state. And if we can be proud of our government on so many things in American history, then we also have to take this side, right? We can't say we're happy about this and that, but we don't want to. We like the founding fathers, except they were all slaveholders, right? We can't, we can't have it two ways, right? Freedom only made sense because of slavery, what it meant to be free. So the American project is so deeply made meaningful by slavery that it seems to me, in the end, it's incumbent upon the national legislature to take it up. So while we're doing it outside of the national legislature, it's not off the hook as far as I'm concerned. But that said, I don't have a lot of hope.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I focus in my book on the NAACP's campaign against racial violence, and one of the chapters focuses on the anti-lynching bill in Congress. And this was I follow it basically from around 1921 to 1922, right? And that was the fourth time that they had actually gotten hearings and were trying to pass a federal anti-lynching bill. And the reason why I bring that up to this question, besides the point that James Weldon Johnson was a huge person that was campaigning around the anti-lynching bill, is that there's so much in this country, especially in terms of our national legislature, that it does not at all address huge racial wrongs, and it's very resistant to that. I also very much agree that I don't think this idea that will the government address reparations, I don't think I think it could possibly happen. This is maybe the idealist in me in my lifetime, but I think it's definitely going to come from at the state and also at the local levels. And you're seeing that a little bit. I mean, just two things that I want to call out. In in 1995, after the Rosewood Massacre, right, finally the Florida legislature, right, they then passed, I think it's like, yeah, you know, it's like an over $20 million like bill as a type of repair for all of the harm that was caused in Rosewood. And right now, last year in, what's it called? Where's Northwestern?
Evanston, Illinois.
Yeah, in Evanston, their tax on marijuana is going into basically a trust for the Black residents of Evanston to decide where that money actually goes to, right? And so most cities, such as my own as Seattle, it like goes to public infrastructure and good things, right? But Evanston took a specific stand and said that we understand that there was a history of displacement in our community, of gentrification. We know that we have displaced Black people in our community, and this is a small step, perhaps, in the right direction. And so hopefully more attempts like that hopefully we'll start to see a lot more of that. And I have no doubt that that's in part because of the work of many people on this panel and other people who are raising like the alarm and raising awareness about the need to think about more creatively ideas of repair and what does accountability look like.
So 2 more questions for me, and then we'll open it up for audience questions. So I am mindful that we are in a nonpartisan space, so I'm not asking anybody to advocate for any candidate. But we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that reparations has played a bigger role in the Democratic sort of presidential contest this year than in previous years. Can you assess the way that reparations has been discussed this cycle without endorsing a candidate?
Good luck, Darrick.
Who's it addressed to?
Just the discussion, the dialogue around reparations this cycle. So,
Okay, you go ahead.
I mean, I'm more optimistic than my co-panelists. And I'm being serious. Right now, the Democratic platform is the commission. If you, across the panelists, across the presidential candidates, especially when they just started out, it was almost coming to consensus that we should have the commission to study reparations. Many of the remaining candidates believed that we should study reparations. That's progress. The fact that we hear reparations in a presidential debate, that's progress. So whether it happens this cycle, the next cycle, or the cycle after that, we've had some progress. So that doesn't mean we should let up and be too rosy-eyed, but you know, I'm optimistic that we are at the point to talk about racial justice in an explicit way. It's no longer the third rail of politics, and perhaps that's some silver lining associated with, I got tenure, I can be partisan, Donald Trump. Perhaps that is some of the potential silver lining associated with having a president in office who is not even through a dog whistle, but through a bullhorn, using divisively racial language, that we have come to the point where we no longer have to sugarcoat race, at least in the questions. We can be more direct and explicit. So I guess I'll just end and say, again, I'm optimistic that it can happen, and it can happen in my lifetime.
I think just to quickly add in, I think it can be viewed as an opportunity but we have to kind of seize on it, because my sense of our society tends to be, we have quick, our attention goes from one thing to the next. And so the fact that it had a congressional hearing, the 1619 getting a lot of attention, worthwhile, the 1619 project, I should say, getting a lot of attention, being incorporated in Chicago public schools, for example, and in other school systems, is an opportunity to something that you said earlier about creating and fostering awareness of the legacies of slavery, repression, oppressions, and the like, up to mass incarceration, the health disparities, and providing more opportunity to learn about it, right? Be it in museums, being in schools and textbooks, preparing teachers is the work that I do. So in preparing teachers to go out and teach it, and preparing them to have that hard conversation. And I think there's been a lot of work, good work being done on framing historical narratives in the language of trauma. And how do we talk about trauma? And the fact that we oftentimes don't talk in the language of trauma. And I think if we were to do it as a community, to engage in it. And akin to Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, but obviously slightly different because it's in its context. But I think there's something around, we need to sit with it, right? But we have to kind of really grab at this opportunity that it's in the platforms. It's on their websites, right? You can look up their stance on reparations, which growing up, no one would have, you wouldn't have expected it. It would have been around the proverbial, kitchen table, not necessarily in this space.
There was an interesting article in the Washington Post recently about work that's actually being done in South Carolina, Jim Clyburn, in I don't remember the name of the legislation, but it was intended to be dealing with inequality, deep poverty, and using federal funds, but directing it in such ways that whites and blacks were benefiting, but it's being described as reparations rebranded, right? In fact, that was the title of the article. And it's suggesting that that was something that also many of the Democratic candidates could easily see themselves presenting. So it's not quite reparations the way that we described it, but it is a way of thinking boldly about legislation. And so a cynic would say, well, you do that in lieu of reparations. Another could say it's beginning to see the narrative and actual policies in ways that makes a discussion about reparations a bit more within the mainstream. And eventually, I guess I'm optimistic by decades.
I'm with you.
I might not be here, as King said, but it may happen.
So I'm going to start with Ali and then move my way back to me. So the final question for me, and I hope that you all have really great questions, is when will America rightfully be done with its obligation to pay reparations to African Americans?
Do I need to answer that? Never.
Okay.
Never. Because what was created through the transatlantic slave trade was a type of inertia of energy that recreates itself. Inequality breeds itself. It changes its shapes, it changes forms, it changes dynamics that hold on to the very first thing that it used to create the process. So if that's the case, what do you use, what do you create that pushes against that? Okay? You have to create a system, not a policy, but a system that pushes against inequality. We live in a capitalistic system that breeds off of creating inequality. If we do not embrace another type of system that pushes against that, we're never going to get out of the cycle. The last thing I'll mention is we are living in a time right now that is essentially an experiment. The civil rights movement created desegregation, civic, political, you could also maybe argue economic, but this is still an experiment. And in that experiment, inequality persists. So I want you to think about that for understanding what reparation policies can actually do. Again, if we don't create not a policy, but a system that works against inequality, and not just on racial terms, but on all forms of social status, then we're not going to ever solve the problem.
I take a dim view too, but I take a dim view in a different kind of way, meaning the dim view I take is of humankind. I mean, the world is full of atrocities, and there have been many. No doubt what happened here was horrible, and so many around the world. So I guess I would hope that we continue to try to correct for it in the ways that Ali talked about, though I think she seems much more as pessimistic than I am about it. But I do think if we aspire at least, maybe we'll get there at some point.
So I'm the optimist on the panel. Inequality is not irreversible, nor is it our destiny. Inequality is a political choice. Likewise, we can have justice, morality as a political choice. I think if we start thinking about the use of race and how we ended up with that choice, it will enlighten us on how we could address that choice and have a different system. We always think about race as an issue. It's almost an afterthought. There's a built-up scholarship about the ways in which politics and economics integrates in towards building consolidation. And let me even dispel this other thing, that my discipline, economics, has been really good at pulling the wool over people's eyes into thinking that markets are somehow natural, that markets are somehow our destiny. Markets are political construction. And when people try to give me rebuttals, they say, well, what about a farmer's market? That's a political construction. Who gets a permit? Who gets the right? So there's nothing natural about it. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing. We may make decisions about when it's appropriate to have a market frame. We might make decisions about when the public shouldn't allow certain decisions to be rationed based on profit considerations or price decisions, and say that the government should ensure an adequate quantity, quality, and access to these goods, like health care as a right, like the right to a debt-free college education. We can keep naming them. We could think about what are the essential goods and services that people need in their lives to really have agency. And after that point, if one wants to have a market system of who gets to decide on whether to go to the disco or not, to me those are somewhat frivolous compared to if you're hungry or not, right? So again, these things are political choices. And then here's how race plays into that. Why is it that in reaction to perhaps the New Deal period, when we might have been trending towards an economic rights frame, again, obviously with the big flaw of exclusion of black people, how were we able to usher in this radical frame of neoliberalism where we believe that the market and marketized solutions is the answer to all our problems, economic or otherwise? That's become our dominant discourse, and it's not changed. It's not challenged. It's a dogma that goes unchallenged. We don't even consider any other alternatives. So how did we get to that radical position? It was race. It was being able to tell white people, the dominant class, that however unequal you might be or how unequal society may be, at least you're not black. At least you're not a Mexican. At least you're not othered. And humans care about our vertical positioning as well as our horizontal positioning. And as we become more vertically unequal, horizontal positioning has more saliency. It becomes more valuable. The property rights to whiteness has a greater return when there's greater inequality. So we can appeal to different things in people. We can, and I don't think this is pie in the sky, we can appeal to common humanity. We can appeal to morality. We can appeal to sustainability. When we appeal to those type of elements in an authentic way, then perhaps stratification and race loses its saliency, and this ties all back in. Reparations becomes a critical acknowledgement of that past and redress for us to get beyond our race problem so that we can have that type of society.
So my short answer is never, but the way I think about it is I don't hope for a piece of legislation or a piece of kind of culminating act of hard work, because what I've looked and learned from history is that when Brown v. Board came about, the work that went into it, that led up to it, was so monumental, but how it was carried out afterwards is created so many different problems that oftentimes we don't talk about as much as we talk about leading up to it. Similarly with civil rights bills, similarly with a lot of culminating, we stop with, we got it, check, we're done, and we don't look at how it's actually carried out. So the way I kind of view it, I don't know if it's Buddhist or the idea of like all life is struggle, right? The idea that it's a constant where it, not a struggle in terms of it's a burden, but it's a constant where we have to continually rebuild our connections, our communities, rebuild our sense of morality and justice. So, but it's a constant, right? We don't look for the policy to satisfy our goal. We look for the carrying out that policy until the next one carries out, until the next one carries out. So hopefully that's our life work, is that we're constantly working towards better connections, And I don't think there is an endpoint other than the sun blowing up in, 10 minutes, what have you. But other than, like, I've realized that I don't think it's like, oh, we got reparations, we're done, right? Even if it's in 100 years or 400 years, to me, it would seem like it would have to be the struggle, both the proverbial struggle as well as kind of a more broader struggle across all peoples and whatnot, so.
So I'm kind of stuck in a bit of a middle place here. I'm often stuck between my experiences and my work as a Black woman in this country and knowing the permanence of white supremacy and racism, and also believing and understanding the many ways that it has changed and that it is incredibly dynamic. And yet at the same time, I am also caught in a belief of this idea, again, around a need to reclaim a type of radical imagination. And so I often actually go back again to my research, which is very much, and I sit with this a long time, especially in terms of the early NAACP. So finding between 1909 and 1923. And this is civil rights, and also I focus on Ida B. Wells in my research. But this was a time in which actually the term civil rights, that wasn't there. When we say civil rights today, there's something that jumps in everybody's mind, right? It means something to people. But back then, they were trying to fight for political and legal rights when the federal government had actually never granted and or protected Black people's lives, right? Kind of the period that I actually research in, Black people are legit fighting for their very lives, asking the government and private individuals to protect Black people from mob violence and lynchings that were happening across the South as well as the North. And oftentimes I got it, when I presented my research initially, people would ask me, well, wait, why would these Black people continue to like fight in this country? Why didn't they just leave? Or, right, like that's a whole nother lecture. Or it would also be, why did they continue to contest the political and legal systems in this country? And I, for a while, if I'm perfectly honest, did not have a good answer. But one of the things that I've come to believe is that these individuals, Ida B. Wells, James Weldon Johnson, Walter White, not of Breaking Bad, but of the NAACP, really, right, believed in a type of justice, in a type of system that they could not see, that maybe they would experience in their lifetimes and maybe they would not. And I think that in terms of where we are today is something that they never would have even imagined, but they continued to work really hard towards that. So I'll just end with that. I'm caught between like my own experiences and feeling kind of the worn downness as well as the frustration and the understanding of white supremacy in this country, and at the same time about how much things can change when people who are organized and care work really hard, and things that you don't even imagine possible are possible.
So I will add, I'm actually not a pessimist. I'm what some people may call a pragmatic optimist. And so what that means is that I think we need to be thinking about how to invest in a system that is celebrating our humanities. And if we do so, we create a system that then grows the differences, the flattening of the inequality. We can regrow. And what happens, just as humans, we keep on regrowing cells until we're dead. Yeah. But if you do this within a system, that system never dies. So I'm a pragmatic optimist. I don't believe that nothing can happen. I just think in the system that we're in, it will never happen.
I want to open this up to audience questions. So.